Welcome to the Austin Public Library podcast. My name is Julie Kleinfelter, Director of the Public Library in Austin, Minnesota, and I'm here with my co-host Michael Verde for the 7th podcast of our Reading for Life program. Reading for Life is a movement of the imagination for the purpose of growing community around a shared love of literature. Structured like a book group, but one facilitated to maintain the richest possible dialogue among the participants and the source text, the presentations bridge great novels to dedicated readers. The idea is that real community begins and ends with our imaginations, and few resources, if any, are as vital to the imagination's development as works of literature. Our unofficial tagline for the program is 8 podcasts, 4 books, and you. Today, we're introducing Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Michael and I are joined today by Steve Harson, Public Library Consultant with Southeastern Libraries Cooperating Regional System. Welcome to Steve. And Michael, we'll get started a little bit. In the last podcast, you told listeners not to worry about the heady stuff, but to consider how the words were bonding together in this book. Can you talk a little bit about that? When you read a book, how do you stay focused on the words and how they're bonding together?
Sure. First thing, I want to make an analogy between what we're talking about here in the scientific revolution. So in the scientific revolution, we can associate that with Francis Bacon. The big idea was that heretofore, what truth meant was something you could find in one of two principal ways. If you were imagining truth through the Judeo-Christian tradition or from Jerusalem, then truth was revealed by God. You found it in scripture. If you imagined truth as accessed through Athens, principally through Plato and his principal exponent, Aristotle, then the royal road to truth was reason and using a kind of dialectic, really. And those were the two ways that you arrived at ultimate reality. What was, let's say, novel in the history of our species, in a way, was the idea that, you know what, we'll bracket both of those things and consider them opinions. And we're going to go directly to nature, and we're going to try to understand reality as it reveals itself empirically. And I want to say that because there's the analogy to be made here is that you can imagine having opinions about a novel, or you can imagine going right to the words and trying to do something that is imaginatively like the empirical investment in letting nature reveal the ultimate truths. If you see what I mean. I mean, the idea of the revolution, scientific revolution is, listen, nature has a reality that we need to be attentive to as opposed to dictating to it some kind of transcendental or transcendent structure. So that, and if we get that, then that means we have to have a certain degree of confidence that language has something to reveal to us. In other words, there's a kind of intelligence in the words. There's not a kind of intelligence. There may be an entire universe of intelligence in the words. Another way of putting this is Arnold, Schwarzkopf, who was so big a leader in the first Iraqi war, apparently has an IQ of something like 160 or 80 or something ridiculous. And J.D. Salinger apparently has an IQ of 100. But I don't believe that Schwarzkopf could have written The Catcher in the Rye. And what I'm trying to say is that maybe Salinger's intelligence wasn't the kind of thing that shows up on IQs, but maybe he had a gift for paying attention to language. One thing that would be true of all writers is that they're all readers. And another thing that's almost certainly true is that there are people who fell in love with language. What I'm trying to get at is that our, let's say, thinking is only one half of the equation. The words are the other half. And it's the wedding between those two things. And the intellect doesn't wed words. It's the imagination. Well, the intellect can wed words, but it weds them analytically. The imagination weds words, but it weds them metaphorically. So you mentioned the word, how words bond to each other. They bond to each other through metaphors. They bond to each other through associations. And some of these are incidental to the language. We're going to be talking about a book originally written in Spanish, so this is sort of relevant. You can have a word that just because of the particular language you speak reverberates with other words, just incidentally. So in English, maybe you have something, and this is kind of silly, but a man called O-V-E, in a sweet, okay, well, when you look at that, the first time I looked at it, when it's translated into English, I saw O-V-E and I thought of love. That's just because the OVE happens to be incidentally in the, okay. Some of those things are incidental that are particular to a language, but some of those things are not incidental and they cut across languages. And this is really what metaphors can do. They can link words to words in such a way that it gets down to fundamental depths of human desire and human concern. And this is very different than figuring out the meaning of the universe abstractly. So look, let's jump it. Okay, so having said that, let's do something with this novel that exemplifies the point. Let's take the three main characters and just pay attention to their names. In other words, let's forget being smart about the characters and let's just read their names. So Fermina Daza, Fermina, for the same word as terra firma, or earth. It resonates with firm, it resonates with soil, it resonates with ground. The last name is Daza. In Spanish, it means sorghum or a grass plant. So just playing around with the words, you got a main character whose name is something like earth and grass plant. And you know, in other words, you don't have to know anything but pay attention to those words. Now, you may not know what it means, but you've at least pay attention to the words that you have a main character who has been so identified with the earth and with something growing out of the earth that you can't miss it. Florentino, Ariza. Florentino related to flora or flower. Ariza in Spanish related to sunrise. You got a flower that rises with the sun, and you got another protagonist that is the earth with plant grass. Again, we don't have to know anything, but we're just paying attention to the words. Juvenile, urbino, juvenile for juvenile or baby or childish, and urbino for urban. If you know the novel, that resonates very directly with this character. So these are examples of what I mean by metaphor. Look how the language, just by paying attention to what these words mean, associate images. And with those images now in play, the imagination can start making associations. If the intellect came to this first without the imagination's participation, it would try to be smart. And it would try to develop some kind of theory about what this book meant that had to do with concepts or whatever. And it may or may not be resonating with the novel at all. I'm saying the imagination thinks differently than the intellect, and that the imagination thinks in metaphors. So that's the first thing I mean about forget all the heady stuff. I'm really saying forget the intellect trying to figure out a math problem or even trying to give you a metaphysical answer to the meaning of life. Put that in brackets and let your imagination participate in the images that are implicit in the language. Give it something to work with. Do you see what I mean? Is that helpful? And yes. You can teach this to anybody. In other words, now we've actually made this a more democratic practice because everyone, with regards to their imagination, is qualified to do this. I've had people come into my classrooms who imagined, because they were straight A students, that they were somehow had a privileged access to literature with kids on the other side of the classroom that are barely getting by at all. And by 2 or 3 weeks into the classroom, as a teacher, hey, you know what, this kid that's not supposed to be so bright, I think he or she really gets this in a way that some of these straight A students may or may not. And also because the straight A students may be trying too hard to be smart. So that's really what I mean. Trust language to work with your imagination, to inspire insights and ideas that you didn't figure out. That's the key thing. This is coming up sort of indigenously from your imagination. It's giving you insights. You're not the one cracking the code. But that will not happen if you don't feed it something. And that's what I mean about paying attention to language. If you pay attention to language, and we just gave 3 very simple examples. I mean, these are the main characters. You would think if an artist ever paid attention to how he or she was going to name a main character, use a metaphor, you would think that the main character would sort of be ripe for very concentrated imaginative investment. So if we just start there, and then you could go to the title and do the same sort of thing. It's a different kind of intelligence than what we use to navigate the universe and what we typically associate with smart. And in fact, that is a deep theme of this book because Juvenile Urbino does put a great deal of consequence in reason. and particularly science. In fact, it's with this sort of capacity that he is going to save his city from cholera, principally by using what he's learned in medical school and what he's picked up in his European travels. And he is going to sanitize all of the unhygienic aspects that are translating into cholera. In other words, he's going to use science to eradicate the source of death. Another way of saying that, if we're going to think about that, is here is the human being in the Western world who has the idea now that reason is such that he may live forever because he's going to take his own mortality into his intelligence. And he is going to figure out he's going to crack the code on finitude. You see, this is a very Western idea that we're going to marshal our rationality and defeat death. Another main, well, it's a secondary character who plays a main metaphorical role, and that is Jeremiah de Saint-Amour, with whom the novel begins, and he's committed suicide in his 60th year, having told his lover that he would never grow old, and chose on the day of Pentecost to commit suicide. He is associated with playing chess. Chess is a little different than science. Chess is abstract. Chess doesn't involve the physical world. Science involves the physical world. Chess is completely abstraction. So you can think of reason now and associate it with this character. His reason led him to the notion that death simply could not be defeated. And therefore, since he could not bear it, he was going to take his own life. Think of the paradox that this intelligence, using all of its intelligence, commits suicide in the face of death because death is unbearable. Another character uses science and has this Herculean idea that with science, he's going to defeat death, does every possible thing you could do, including taking a medicine every hour on the hour, okay, as a ritual for taking medicine. And then because he's fearful that he's taking too much medicine, he inhales camphor. How does he die? He dies on a ladder reaching for a parrot. In other words, all of the things that he did to defeat death and what happened, life taught him a trick called accidents. These are two people who, in their own way, in the face of death, proved that their solution was not adequate to the nemesis. Reason was undone by finitude or mortality, and science itself is undone by this world, natural world, where accidents happen and where there are things called germs. And no matter all of the projects that you initiate to eradicate every variable, you will find that you die in the most ridiculous way. Now, let's take Florentino Ariza. And here's a guy that I think we can agree, just from on the surface, we can get deeper into it, that in a way he has defeated death. And he has defeated death by arriving at true love. That what he experiences with Fermina moved him into a dimension of reality that death itself is undone by. In other words, there was a whole nother dimension of existence in where death does not have the final authority. But how do you arrive there? Not through the rationality that wins at chess, and not through the use of intelligence that science brings to bear, but through another dimension of consciousness that absolutely involves the body, right? This is a carnal. This is love that is spiritual and carnal. And that's a key point here. Those first two characters we talked about, what are they rejecting deep down? They're rejecting the body. I mean, Jeremiah de Saint-Amour that's symbolized by the fact that from the waist down, his body's useless because of polio. That's not fair to people with polio, but metaphorically, what does it say? That he has a half a body. Now, that we're just playing around now with metaphors. And we've made a kind of interesting connection between what this book is saying about life and death and love. And if we look at the title, Love in the Time of Cholera, what in the world could the time of cholera be? It's a wonderful word. If we play with it metaphorically, the time of cholera. Now, I don't have any privileged access to the meaning here, so I'm just talking out loud. The time of cholera would seem like to be partly the time of death, because when cholera is so then that would tell us something like love in the time of death, or love, time, and death. We've got love, time, and death on the title. Now, is there a way that love can defeat death by entering into another dimension of time? That would be one way to play around with the words, but we're just playing around with the words.
I'd like to say something right here, Michael, is that I think one of the challenges with this book and understanding it is it's written in Spanish and then translated to English. And that when words are translated from one language to another, sometimes they have shades of meaning associated with them that really don't come through in the translation. And in this particular case, the word time, as it's used in the title, love in the time of cholera, actually was los tiempos in Spanish, which is the times. But tiempo in Spanish also means weather.
Wonderful.
And so it's also the weathers, or maybe you could consider that the climate of cholera. And if you think about what those shades of meaning are, that title being very specifically chosen to convey some sort of meaning in regard to the book has a really specific meaning, or a different meaning to a Spanish speaking person than it might to us in English when we see the time of cholera.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
And that happens elsewhere in the book as well.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. And that's why I mentioned that some of these associations are incidental to the particular language. And if you're a poet, you're playing with those. Another great example is one of his many lovers. It's named Ocienza Santander. Now, for the very reason that you just said, related to Spanish, I've gone and just in my simplistic way put in, what does Ocienza mean in Spanish? But specifically, what does it mean in Spanish? And it turns out that it's related to a little phrase that in English would mean, when the cat is away, the mice will play. Now, this is his lover, who's when her husband, or not her husband, who her other lover goes away because he's a ship captain. When he goes out of town, she has this fervent affair with Florentino. So there it is, that when the cat is away, the mice will play. Just to underscore your point of how much this is wordplay, and to get back to Julie's point, that to play around with words like this is very different than to try to be super smart conceptually.
Yeah, the one I had looked up something about the title, and it said that the term cholera, when used in Spanish, can also denote passion or human rage and ire in its feminine form.
Wonderful.
And that also, if you think about then love in kind of the climate of, human rage or ire, that kind of changes and relates to the book as well.
Wonderful. And this is great that with three people are talking. So if I take weather and cholera and relate it to what you just said about some kind of fervor, I'm thinking heat. And now we don't have to be clever about this, because we can lean into the book. First of all, the book says that the symptoms of cholera are the same as love. Mm-hmm. And secondly, and more primarily, is a principal metaphor in this book is fire. And a very special kind of fire, because of the emphasis on Pentecost. When the novel begins, the allusions to, or refer directly to Pentecost are numerous, and they mount on each other repetitively. So let's just play around with fire just a minute, because even playing around with language, choleric or fire, that sounds like heat. Okay, so is there a kind of fire? We play with the idea of fire from Pentecost. There's a fire that comes down. This is not a natural fire. This is the fire that comes down from heaven that ignites the tongues, so the people speak in tongues at Pentecost. And this relates all over the book, because he talks about in certain key moments, including the very ending of the book, that there are times when Florentino speaks that people can feel his words are inspired. Another way of saying that is that his words are on fire. But this would be a different kind of fire, let's say, than the fire that consumes and destroys. This would be closer like the fire that purifies. The fire through which gold passes and the dross is separated from the fire. Now, we're absolutely talking about love and eternity now. What is the fire that our ego and all of the ingredients of ourselves is assayed by, because that's what the word assay means, to assay, to test, or to try by fire. What is the fire that we are thrown into and out of which only what is eternal comes out on the other side? This is the fire that tries us, and everything about us that is not love is consumed in the fire, but everything that is love now is free from death. And the book says that explicitly, that there is a kind of love that death immunizes from contagion. And again, we're just playing around with, I would have not made the connection between heat and weather had the two of you not contributed.
Well, and I'm thinking about what you're saying about the Pentecost here and whatnot, and I'm going like, oh, wait a minute. So if you take that as being in the heat of passion, as the part of the title, and Pentecost being the, Easter is the passion of Christ, and then you're in the period after that, suddenly that stuff is making some sense in a context that might make sense to a Spanish speaker in a way that it doesn't to us as English speakers. And that once we understand that, it may help us understand the metaphor of the book in a little bit different way.
Absolutely. I think probably there's two levels. There are these idiosyncratic things that are related to by convention to our language, so that the signifiers and the signified are completely conventional. And then I would think would lead to a level of nuance and exquisite experience that you would get from poetry that certainly loses. But then I would think that that's also, however, connected to metaphors that might be universal. One of the weird, cool things about languages is that every single language is intertranslatable. There is not a single language that we know about in which two people over time can't work out mutual understanding, which is a very weird thing if you think about it. I mean, that goes right down to, clicks with the Kung Bushman. So I would imagine that there is some kind of language, almost beneath language, that probably communicates in metaphors. In other words, there's a language of images that probably is very much related to things that are deep in each of us. So I think there's two levels here, and certainly at the one level, you would miss some nuance. But another level, these books wouldn't work at all in translation if there wasn't something that was even, sort of grounding in this case. But any case, so we're just playing around with words that get lit by fire. Well, then, gosh, this points us to what is a writer even trying to do? And isn't it interesting that Florentino Ariza, first of all, much of his life has everything to do with reading and writing, and much of the courtship takes place completely. In fact, you could say 99% of the courtship until the climax takes place entirely through reading and writing, whether it's exchange of letters or through telegraph messages, mainly through the exchange of letters, and through the fact that Fermina at some points gets her hands on some of Florentino's late writings that causes her to see him very differently than this sort of forlorn lover in the Park of the Evangels who is, trying to serenade her. In other words, she falls in love in a way with him through what she experiences through his language.
I really like that word serenade that you just used, because in some sense is their story really a serenading of her on his part, as a writer would serenade her rather than a singer.
I think that's beautiful. And then we would just say we're talking about the muse here in a way. Mm-hmm. And then that's interesting. Then if we think about this playfully, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the same kind of Pilgrim's Progress that Florentino is on, we could say there's a parallel to that the writer, in this case, we could just say Marquez, but maybe we're talking about Marquez's imagination, which might be a little different than the empirical Marquez. But in any case, then there's another Pilgrim's Progress here related to, can the imagination write a book that defies death? In other words, can I put these words in a certain order that they become inspired? Can I play around with these mortal words until they become supernatural in a way, until they achieve something that death can't defeat? And I would have to think that every artist that in some way is trying to create a body of work that death does not defeat. And I'm guessing that that cuts across all of the arts. And we're making a body, in other words, out of our imagination is making a body interacting with a medium. And the trick would be, can I take this very mortal medium and turn it into something immortal? And can I take these keys on the piano and turn it into something that is not reducible to ivory and ebony? And I would think, can I do that with clay? Can I do that with marble? So then, but look how we got here. We got here playing with a title with 3 people. But if we were all trying to be smart, and worse still, if we were trying to one up each other, not only would we not have arrived at here, we would have actually gone backwards. And I think the perfect parallel, since the book is playing off this, and we can talk about it in explicit ways, the contrast here would be between the Tower of Babel that ends in an absolute Babel and a deep destruction of the city. Contrast that with Pentecost. The scripture playfully does that in a very explicit way. You have the human being who's going to mount up with his collective intelligence, mount up and to sit on the throne of God. So this is man moving up to usurp God's role that ends in Babel, versus the contrary movement of the divine coming down to man and then igniting man and then moving back up. And with those playful directions in mind, let's think about Juvenal Urbino and Florentino Ariza we're using directions. The principal sort of metaphorical trip of Juvenal Urbino's life is in a hot air balloon. Well, what is that? That's moving up on hot air. The principal, really, you could say, journey of Florentino's life is his fantastical idea that he's going to go to the bottom of the ocean and bring up the riches of these Spanish galleons. So it's absolutely moving in the opposite direction. He's moving down to find the gold, versus Urbino that's moving up. And look, what are we playing around with? If a seed falls in the ground and dies, now we're back to Fermina Daza. A Florentino Ariza of a flower that arises with sunrise. There's a heat that's from above it. It's the heat that is giving life to the flower, but the flower has to be grounded. And isn't this really revelatory about the first courtship of Florentino that fails? Because when he finally meets Fermina eye to eye, she realizes what? It was all an illusion. And what begins to get her thinking about that? When she receives messages through the telegraph that he's going to bring up this ship of gold, she starts to wonder if maybe he's not living in an imaginary. In other words, her commitment to reality had to reject his early, let's say, illusory relationship to the transcendent. Do you see what I mean? He had to grow up before she could fall in love with him. And he had to grow up by growing out of these illusory relationships to love.
You know, another thing that something you just said, like suddenly I flashed on, you were mentioned how Fermina's name is Earth and whatnot. The second part of her name, Mina, is mine or treasure.
Okay.
And so he's out looking for the sunken gold and the galleons and whatever. And that relates back to that she might be the treasure.
Wonderful.
That he's looking for.
I love it. That she's the treasure, and that relates to a natural body right here.
Mm-hmm.
And think about, and okay, so let's keep that in mind, because there's something else going on here. All of this imagery related to scriptural language. So Pentecost, Jeremiah to say no more, the spark of the evangels. Okay, that you've got church stuff, high communion. This is high communion on the day that actually the day that Juvenal Urbino dies, and he's never missed mass. You got all of this religious language, but it looks like that it's ultimately not about religion. In other words, maybe this is a a kind of religion that doesn't reject the body. It's what you just said. You're maybe looking for your treasure when you get to heaven after you die, but you may have just rejected the human body right here.
Mhm.
This is a very different way to arrive at eternity, and it involves embracing, including the body in its state of maximum decrepitude. Could there have been a more beautiful written love scene when these two guys make love the first time and all of their, bodily imperfections? And yet their love wasn't vanquished by it. It wasn't even diminished by it. There was a sense in which that was the ultimate test of the reality of their love. In other words, the body itself is being incorporated into eternity. I'm just taking off what you've just said, that while he was looking for something fantastical in his imagination, and that's a good thing about the imagination because it does believe in the fantastical. But what you just said is maybe the fantastical is also the very tangible, which would take a very different kind of maturity. And it looks like the kind of maturity that these other two fellas just couldn't deal with. So in a way, juvenile Urbino really was a baby because he couldn't ever grow up into accepting the mortal condition. He couldn't even accept his own body. In a way, so he was always really kind of a baby in that sense. In other words, there might be a kind of maturity that involves the death of illusions, including the illusion that we're going to conquer mortality using our mind. And now what makes it so profound is this is really, if you're talking about reason, science, and a kind of carnal love competing for what is the royal road to eternity, this is cutting right to the Western imagination.
There's also a part of this that here Juvenal is in possession of the mine where the riches actually are, but he doesn't know how to celebrate that with joy. He doesn't recognize the value of that treasure.
Wonderful. And the book talks specifically about why that isn't the case, and it's his commitment to accuracy. His commitment to the clock was so fastidious and assiduous that he couldn't even make good love to Miss Barbara Lynch because he was so conscious of the clock that when he would go over for his affair, he would have to get in and out without, metaphorically or otherwise, without, it's like Cinderella with the clock. In other words, he failed because he believed in a kind of exactitude. An exactitude that proved to be absolutely blind because it was like penny wise and pound foolish. He was accurate about everything except the only thing that ultimately mattered. Think about this wonderful line when now is his last thing that he says to his wife. He's fallen, speaking of the Tower of Babel, he's fallen from this ladder in which, talking about Pentecost and the tongues, he's being mocked by a parrot, which would suggest that this was a guy that all of his life was parroting cliches. He himself was the parrot of his ideological conditioning. He never said anything that was original. He read everything from the latest stuff from Le Figaro and Le Monde Revue. Okay, he was absorbing the fashion of the time, and he was throwing it back out in a kind of a self-absorbed way that gave him kind of privileged standing status-wise. Okay, this is how he lived his life. And that's how he died. There's a wonderful line in the book. There's nothing resembles a man more than the way he dies. This is later on in the book telling you better go back and pay attention to the way these people die. I mean, again, this is what paying attention. You don't have to be smart. That in my theory, the book says nothing resembles a man more than the way he dies. This is what I mean about paying attention to the words, Julie. Absolutely. It's not trying to be tricky. It's trying to reveal.
It's right there.
It's trying to reveal it in a way that your imagination is participating in it. But in any case, so this is a guy that on his last thing he says to his wife, this is to exemplify the point of you winning the whole world but lose your own soul. The last thing he says to his wife is, only God knows how much I love you. How much I loved you, because it's a past tense. Now, that's a big indictment on the way he lived.
Well, and it's also a big revelation that he didn't recognize it.
There you go. If only God knows, that means you failed to communicate something.
Exactly.
You lived your whole life and you made it to the top. You're everything that anybody could want to be socially and economically. You're a rich man. You have everything. And with all of those riches, you failed to communicate. Speaking of communion and high mass, and you failed to communicate the one thing you were born to experience. Hence, you're a baby.
Mhm.
All of that right there. A main character's last words. I think if you're going to pay attention to anything, in other words, these are not subtle things that we're talking about here. What bigger point here is that anybody can learn to pay attention like this. It's just, we're talking about different languages. Fiction speaks in a kind of language. It speaks in a language that includes the body. And it does that with metaphors, and it does it with myth. So I just want to say, if we're talking about foreign languages and native languages, we can playfully say that fiction is both a foreign and a native language. It's foreign to us in the West, maybe, because we've invested so much in a kind of intellect that rejects the body. This is why poetry isn't real to us, but these scientific journals are. You see what I mean? Now, this may not be true in other cultures where they haven't privileged the intellect. So this book is reading us, is another way of saying it.
That really, I think that sets us up really good for the lecture, because that explains exactly what my question was, which was, how do you read for the words to see how they're bonded together? And the other thing that strikes me about this book, and is true of others that we've talked about it, is the idea that reading this in your 20s would probably be an entirely different experience than reading it in your 40s, than reading it in your 60s. And I think that's kind of a fascinating piece too, is that, you change, the novel stays the same in theory, but you change. And so how you read it changes.
Yeah, and you can tell me when it's time to stop. But related to that point is, there is a lot of things that you might just say are unusual sexually, but you might not think they're so unusual at 60 as you would at 20. And that relates to one of the lines in the novel. The novel says that you don't teach life anything. In other words, this is what the first sort of shocking afflatus to Juvenile Urbino is, the fact that his good friend was maintaining a clandestine sexual relationship with a mulatto on the poor side of town, all of which gets revealed posthumously in a letter. And Juvenile Urbino, the person of intellect, his mind is blown that there was a whole subterranean existence that he wasn't. Well, isn't this true of his whole life? There was an entire subterranean universe that he never participated in. And when he got close to participating in it, he did it clunkily, like a misfit.
Mm-hmm.
So this relates to your point. You may have to live a little while to know how weird life is, and you may have to live a little bit longer to not bring to that weirdness your conditioned judgments or ideological reflexes, including those that you probably incorporated in a religious context, because all of those judgments will disqualify you from participating in certain experiences of the body, because you will have written that off as bad or as a sin. This book would just be too much for you. And I appreciate the moral courage of a writer that does not make deals with the superego. Okay, to write a book like this, and when you start talking about America, you talk about the girl that was 14.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking into stuff that would just be flat out pedophilia, right? This is Lolita times 10. You could imagine where this whole book would just collapse because of that. This protagonist now has done what would constitute rape. And can you deal with that? I don't know. But what we want to say is, the imagination is not really asking you, okay? That whether we like it or not, there's a part of in other words, I'm saying there's a subterranean universe that may be beyond good and evil. And the arts, for some reason, just won't let go of bearing witness to that world. And that's why the arts freak a lot of people out.
I think we should pause.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm just saying, I think we should pause there, because I think that gets us to a good stopping point. We still have a lot of time to talk about this.
And you can decide whether to cut that out. because that really is a deal. You could
Actually, I wouldn't cut that out because I think that's really strong. And what I was about to say is that in Colombia, at the time this book was written, 14 was not rape.
Okay, there you go.
And in America, 150 years ago, 14 was not rape. And I think that's something about our times, that's baggage we bring along to this book as we read it, that we probably need to deal with before we read the book.
Right. I mean, well, you can shut up with that, but you can imagine a book club where, Steve, if you said that, someone would come up out of their seat and that would just be the end of this book club because you are not knowing it, supporting whatever, pedophilia,
right.
whatever. And all I want to say is the arts don't give a shit. You can you can reject the book. That's fine. The book still exists.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Okay. There's so many things. We just like exploded the podcast right there. That's perfect.
Right.
And we'll figure out how to end, how to do that. But I think that's great because there's a lot of things that then will lead us to the lecture piece, which I think will bring up a lot of really good conversation. And then that second podcast.
Absolutely. There's I got to get to work on reading this again now.
You do. You do.
This
you
book
have a
blows
week.
me away. I love this book. It's so friggin' intelligent. And when you read people's reactions to it, a lot of it is tepid. And it's tepid because they're not really getting it. They're not really getting it.
That's absolutely true.
Well, and it's interesting because I just recently read a review of a different book entirely that I loved. And it turned out there was a huge controversy. And I'm really torn because my 15-year-old loved it too, and then was devastated when they heard about this controversy. And I was like, but they're missing the point. Like, you don't let that ruin what you got out of this book. And so it's a really interesting, I think it's an important part of, I think, where we are as a society, that we get hung up on these things and then we completely miss the point. And I feel like that's just the human problem, is that we get hung up on all these little things and we miss all the big points.
Well, that's what the novel's about, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yep. I really feel like this conversation this evening was a perfect setup for the discussion to come with this book.
Okay, good.
I feel like what we talked about really will open people's eyes into like looking into this and imagining and considering some things that they might not have otherwise. So I feel really good about being here.
And you know what? We did this without any script. It was our imaginations riffing off. And that means that, in other words, that we needed each of our imaginations to complete our own imaginations. And this is precisely what I mean about community and the possibility of entering into a kind of conversation that does not culminate in you're on this team and you're on this team and we're about to wallop each other to death and we're going to make a lot of money with enmity. In other words, this is a different way of being community, and we don't even have to agree about things, but we're participating in a kind of communication, honestly, that a democracy that is not a giant pyramid absolutely depends upon.
Yep.
There's something real at stake here, in other words, and I think the library can be the mecca of this, because that is where the books, and metaphorically and literally, that is the nucleus of the imagination, and that's just why I love that.
Until next time, this is the Reading for Life podcast, signing off.